Welcome to the Cafe Culture podcast, a season of discussions on culture, politics, philosophy and science.
At a talk recorded on the 16th of November, 2015, Ben Alderson-Day discussed hearing voices.
Thanks very much, Pauline, and thanks to Lorraine for inviting me to speak here this evening. Thanks for everybody to coming along on a cold November evening. Today I'm going to be talking a bit about the experience of hearing voices, and not just any voices, voices that nobody else can hear, voices that occur seemingly in the absence of a speaker. They're sometimes referred to as auditory or auditory verbal hallucinations, but some people who've had the experience don't particularly like the term hallucination. It can be a bit problematic, so for the most part this evening I'm going to stick to terms like voice hearing or hearing voices. As Pauline said, I'm a researcher in psychology at Durham University, and I'm on this project called Hearing the Voice, which is set up to study the experience of auditory hallucination or voice hearing. Most people probably immediately think something like schizophrenia or psychosis or madness when they hear about hearing voices. And hearing voices is thought to be a key feature of schizophrenia. About 75% of people who receive a diagnosis of schizophrenia will report hearing voices of some kind or having other experiences of unusual sounds. Accordingly, most of the research that's been done on the topic has been done with samples of people with a diagnosis of schizophrenia, and most of that research has examined things like what's going on in the brain when people report hearing voices, or what kinds of drugs might be able to help them manage those voices better. But for many years it's been recognised that hearing voices also occurs in other contexts too. For starters, it occurs in other mental health conditions, other psychiatric conditions, such as bipolar disorder, post-traumatic stress disorder, certain kinds of depression as well. Notably, hallucinatory experiences of many different kinds, including voices, are very common in the short term and long term in response to drugs. There was lots of coverage earlier in the year in the Lancet Psychiatry paper on the link between certain kinds of cannabis and certain psychotic experiences, including hearing voices. Other kinds of drugs such as methamphetamine, sometimes people who use a lot of methamphetamine will start to develop hearing voices, and sometimes those voices will carry on even after they've stopped using drugs. But more broadly in the wider population, actually, experience of hearing voices is relatively common. You see estimates of between 5 to 15%, depending on the study you look at, for experience of unusual sounds or voices at least once in somebody's life that people will report. They can occur in response to stress, they can occur in response to grief, they can occur in response to sleep deprivation, for example. And some people report hearing voices regularly, as much as once a day, for all their lives, and they never seek help from mental health services. They're just getting on with their life, and they've had a voice as long as they can remember. They're not very common, these people. They're probably less than 1% of the population, but they are out there. And sometimes their voice might have a spiritual significance for them. Sometimes that voice might be described in a way which is quite similar to an imaginary friend. But it does occur. And it's this kind of wider view on the experience of hearing voices, going beyond schizophrenia, going beyond just psychiatry or medicine's view of the experience, that we're interested in hearing the voice. And that's reflected in our team, along with psychologists like myself and people with a training in psychiatry as well. We have scholars in philosophy, in theology and religion, in literary studies, in history, and in the social sciences and medical humanities. We've been working together for about 3 years. We've just received some more money from the Wellcome Trust to carry on working for another few years as well, which we're really pleased about. And the topic that we've been mainly focused on so far has been what it's like to hear a voice, what we would call the phenomenology of the experience. We've been focusing on that because historically, arguably, it's been a bit overlooked. There was a time within psychiatric practice, medical practice, where it was almost discouraged to ask about what it feels like to hear a voice, or maybe what the voices are saying. What was important was to establish whether voices were present or not, because that could affect somebody's prognosis. And that means that a lot of questions didn't get asked about the impact of the experience, what it feels like, what it means to a voice hearer. And it's important to ask those sorts of questions because it can have an impact upon therapy, it can have an impact upon treatment, and it's important for establishing whether you're comparing like with like. I've just mentioned many different contexts in which people can talk about hearing voices. It's really important to know, if we want to draw comparisons across these different contexts, to know whether one person saying I'm hearing a voice is actually similar to the experience that somebody else might be talking about when they use the term voice. Now, in focusing on the topic of what it's like to hear a voice today, there are some things that I maybe won't talk about so much. Because I'm a psychologist and not a psychiatrist, I'm not going to talk about drugs that much, whether they're antipsychotics or recreational drugs. That's not my specialism. And maybe it'll come up later in the Q&A. I'm also not going to talk that much about the brain. One of my jobs on Hearing the Voice is actually to design brain scanning studies on the topic of hearing voices. But it's the kind of thing that can either be very dry or really benefits from the use of visual aids and PowerPoint and all the things that I've been forbidden to bring this evening. So I'm very happy to answer questions about that later on, but I'm not going to talk about that so much today. What I'd really like to leave you with in my talk today is more of an insight into, as I say, this experience of what it's like to hear a voice, and to cover some of the different and varied experiences that people talk about when they talk about voices, and how sometimes, strangely, it might not even involve much hearing at all. So what is it like? Well, we usually define hearing voices, well, as researchers or clinicians, as experience of speech in the absence of a speaker that has a sufficient sense of reality to feel like a real perception. So it's got to be something that makes you think that somebody's there, something that makes you turn around and think, oh, something is speaking to me, or this light is about to hit my head, something like that. In most cases, voice hearers report them as feeling distinct from their own thoughts. They feel like voices that are heard rather than thought. They appear to come up out of nowhere. They're uncontrollable, and they feel like they come from someone else. I'm going to give you an example. This is from a voice hearer called Stephen Schultes. He describes his voices in two different ways. He talks about having voices that are inside and outside the head. And for his voices inside the head, he says, "When I hear these voices, it's as if someone is talking to me. There are male and female voices, loud and clear, easily distinguishable from my own thoughts, and sounding very realistic. I can communicate with these voices, and they react to my thoughts. It's difficult to ignore them." Now, most of what we know about the experience of hearing voices comes from surveys and case reports of people with a schizophrenia diagnosis. And what those surveys say is that actually most people who report hearing voices usually hear more than one, on average around about 3 or 4 at least. They can be loud or quiet, voices that are reported. They can mumble or be clear. They can speak to you or they can speak about you in the first, second or third person. Some people have suggested that voices that speak in the second person are more common, voices that say, "You're a loser," or "You shouldn't have done that," or "Why did you do that?" In fact, you get voices of all different kinds, sometimes talking between themselves about a voice hearer, possibly in quite neutral terms. It was once thought that it mattered whether the voices felt like they were coming from inside the head or outside the head. At one time within psychiatry, voices that were reported as coming from outside the head, external hallucinations, were considered true hallucinations, which were an indicator of quite a serious psychosis, or an example of schizophrenia. Whereas voices reported as being inside the head were thought to be possibly pseudo-hallucinations, voices which might be like an internal conversation, might be a bit more like thoughts. It was quite hard to place what somebody meant by voices inside the head. And so they were more associated with examples of psychotic experiences that might be linked to depression or other types of mental health difficulty. In fact, now most researchers wouldn't respect that distinction whatsoever. It seems like whatever the diagnosis, whatever the impact on somebody, voices can be inside or outside and can still be a real serious problem. If anything, sometimes people who've got voices right inside their head feel like they can't get away from them, that the mixture with their own thoughts even has more impact on how they're functioning. So yeah, this distinction between true and pseudo hallucinations is falling away, very much so in the past 10 years. what the voices say is usually the thing that comes up the most when you talk to voice hearers. Lots of voices are pretty unpleasant. They might call you names, tell you you're worthless, sneer at what you're doing or how you're feeling. Voices can be angry, threatening or controlling, and they're often described as being commanding. So there was a survey conducted by researchers in Melbourne in 2004 where they did some reanalysis of it last year and published a report in Schizophrenia Bulletin, where 80% of the voices that people described were could be classified as constant, commanding, and commenting on what people were doing. Now, sometimes those commands will be violent as well, although very often that will actually be violence towards the voice hearer rather than towards other people. Whenever you hear about hearing voices in the media, invariably it's in the context of risk and in the context of violent crime. But actually, more often than not, where voices are violent, it's about damage and harm to the voice hearer themselves, and you're much more likely to come across people who harm themselves because of what the voices are saying as compared to harming other people too. And the feeling of command or control from the voice is linked to its perceived identity. Lots of voice hearers talk about their voices as having a distinct personality or persona that feels separate from them. A seminal study conducted by the psychiatrists Tony Ianni and Anthony David in the South London and Maudsley Trust in the 90s, they found that whether voice hearers were male or female, they were much more likely to report hearing voices that sounded like they were a man. Very often that accent was actually dissimilar to their own and was quite often described as maybe like a BBC voice, a middle to upper middle class voice that had a sense of authority and usually sounded like it took on a social rank of some kind. So maybe the voice of a judge or a doctor or a policeman. And often voices seem to have this sort of authority to them that gives them this command over the voice hearer. Sometimes the voices of specific individuals are heard. For example, there was a case series a couple of years ago from Norway where a lady described regularly hearing the voice of the musician Prince. And this voice of Prince was actually very supportive and guiding for her. It was a positive experience that she'd had. Other times people report hearing voices of particular politicians or famous people of different kinds. But very often that will be mixed in with quite a separation from reality as well, what in psychiatry would be considered a delusion. Sometimes spiritual deities are heard, or not necessarily God or the devil, but maybe angels or demons of some kind. That's what the voice hearer will think that they're hearing in the voice that speaks to them. But probably more common are voices which are a bit more like a vague stereotype or trope. As I mentioned, something like almost a doctor's voice or a policeman's voice. Or sometimes people talk about hearing an old lady's voice or a child's voice. So there's a sense in which there is a persona, there is an identity, but it's not quite a fully formed one. It's quite not necessarily somebody who's a very specific person in the external world. Sometimes voices are described as occurring with other senses too, so people who hear voices are more likely to also experience visions, maybe experience funny smells or feelings of touch to their body. But what you don't tend to see so much, at least in the context of psychosis, are walking and talking hallucinations. So, for example, in the film A Beautiful Mind, John Nash's experience in that are this kind of walking and talking, fully blown, what we call a fused or a multimodal hallucination. Actually, that doesn't get reported much at all. It's much more common, this idea of a voice in the dark, a voice that cannot be placed in space or time and doesn't have a vision associated with it. Similarly, if somebody experienced visual hallucinations, they wouldn't often talk to the person experiencing them. It's more common, those sorts of experiences, in things like Parkinson's disease, and there's some evidence that it's also more common in children having these kinds of experiences, but for whatever reason, we don't quite know why, it's not so common in adults who experience psychosis. The peak time for voices and other unusual experiences to start is late adolescence and early adulthood. Now, voices can start at any point in somebody's life, but we usually think about the age range of 17 to 25 as being kind of peak time for voices to start. We don't have any good evidence for specific triggers of why voices occur, But often voice hearers will talk about periods of social isolation, a stressful time at home, problems at university or work. Some of you may have seen the TED talk by psychologist and voice hearer Eleanor Longden on the web. She talks about her voices starting in her first year of university, and they started as a neutral commentary on what she was doing. So she sits on the chair or she goes into the room, and only later did they spiral on to something that would be much more distressing. It's not uncommon to hear about voices starting following a period of sleeplessness, sometimes following drug taking, as I mentioned, and in some cases voices appear to follow a period of abuse or trauma. Now, this is a very controversial topic, the relationship between traumatic experiences and voice hearing. Traditionally, it's possibly something that researchers and clinicians have slightly underplayed, and voice hearer communities and support groups themselves have sought to emphasise more the role of past trauma and childhood trauma, in particular sexual abuse. I think that the field has, over the past possibly only 5 years, has changed quite a lot to recognise that, at least in some cases, there do seem to be quite strong links between people's prior traumatic experiences in childhood and experiences of psychosis in general and hallucinations in particular. But it's a fast-moving field and there's still lots of things to work out. Clearly also, not everybody who experiences trauma of different kinds goes on to experience things like voice hearing, and similarly not everybody who hears voices will have had trauma in their past as well, so there's clearly many other things to establish as well before we talk about strong causal links. And what about voice hearing that isn't a problem? I've mentioned that some people experience voices regularly but never use mental health services, never need to. What about those people? The most of what we know about that group comes from a very large study conducted in Utrecht in Holland in the late 2000s. In fact, Holland is a really important country for hearing voices. It was the birthplace of the international hearing voices movement, started by a psychiatrist, Marius Romme, and a journalist, Sandra Escher, in the late 80s, really in response to talking to voice hearers and learning about their own understandings of what they thought the experience signified, whether that be a spiritual crisis, whether that be a response to family experiences, whether that be something else entirely. Now, the hearing voices movement, as they've been come to know, aren't everybody's cup of tea. They have their own interpretations of where voices come from. But they've been quite important, actually, for some voices in them finding their own story and their own explanation for what happened to them, and coming to their own narrative, really, of how they understand their experience. So, and they're not going away. They're becoming more and more important on the world scene. Day by day, and they had their international congress only 2 weeks ago in Madrid. But I digress. The Utrecht Study, this study of people who hear voices but don't use mental health services, ran from 2006 to 2010. And what they did a national survey in Holland of everybody who'd had experience of hearing voices before but didn't use services. Altogether, they found 103 people who regularly heard voices at least once a month, but didn't qualify for a psychiatric diagnosis, and didn't use mental health services at all. And when I say didn't qualify for a diagnosis, that means that they were hearing voices, but they didn't have any of the other things that usually somebody would be looking for if they thought, well, maybe this person's got an undiagnosed example of schizophrenia or something like that. So they didn't tend to have strongly unusual beliefs that stop them getting on with their lives. They didn't tend to have, sometimes you see disorganised thinking and trouble kind of following a train of thought in people who develop a psychosis. These people didn't have that. They just heard voices and not much else. And the voices that they described were in many ways quite similar to the people who described hearing voices and used clinical services. The voices could be inside or outside the head. They felt distinct from thoughts. They could say single words or full sentences. You could engage them in conversations, and often they'd be commenting on what's going on. A subset of their participants in the Utrecht study also took part in some brain scanning, where they indicated with a button when they were hearing voices or not while they're in the scanner. The kind of things they saw in the brain, the neural signature, was very similar for the clinical and non-clinical voice hearers that they saw, suggesting that there was something similar processes were being involved. But what about the differences? Because it's the differences which are really of interest to see if you could help people who were in distress following hearing voices. I think that there are two key things to pull out of that. The first was that the voices that people described if they didn't use mental health services tended to be more positive. Maybe that's something that you kind of expect anyway. If people who don't have a problem, don't use psychiatric services, if they have a voice which is positive all the time, well, that kind of makes sense. It's not a problem for them. But there's a real chicken and egg question there as to whether they've always just had positive voices, and that means it's never been a problem, or whether it's something about them, something about the context in which they heard voices, or the ways in which it developed, which meant that they only ever had positive voices, but they could have had negative voices. And then in fact, positive and negative voices, a mixture of those, are seen in people who do and don't have a psychiatric diagnosis. It just tends to be that the people who are really in distress tend to have more negative voices than positive voices, or the negative voices somehow have a stronger impact. Another clue in terms of the differences between voices that were and weren't a problem was that people who didn't use services tended to have their first voice hearing experience earlier. So the mean age in this study was age 12 that people reported hearing voices for the first time, and that was compared to a mean age of 21 in the clinical sample. And that raises an interesting possibility, because it could be that when the voices occur in your life makes a big difference to how you respond to them and how they develop. If you've been hearing voices since you were a child or since you were kind of early in teenage years, maybe it's something that you're kind of used to. Maybe it's something that, as I said, is more similar to having an imaginary friend, something you're willing to accept. If you hear voices for the first time when you're on your own at university and you're 18 or 19, you're not sure who you can talk to about it, and it's something that you're not used to, what happens then? Maybe things spiral. Maybe you can't interpret what's going on. Maybe you don't tell anyone. So there's something more to be explored there about whether this difference in age of onset explains some of the distress that's going on, but we need to follow it up with more evidence, really. And what about other conditions? I've mentioned that voice hearing occurs in schizophrenia. I've mentioned that it occurs in people who don't use mental health services at all. But what about all the other contexts that I mentioned as well? Well, that's where we came in. I'm going to talk a little bit now to finish off about a survey that we conducted on voice hearing that was published in the Lancet Psychiatry Journal earlier this year in April. If you're interested in the survey, we also did a podcast for that as well, available on the Lancet Psychiatry website. We were keen to try and get experience of voices in voice hearers' own words, so not using a kind of standard, what we might term a symptom rating scale or a clinical interview, just trying to develop a really open-ended tool that people could write about their voice hearing experiences on their own terms. So we created this online questionnaire. Anybody who considered themselves a voice hearer could fill it in, whether they had a diagnosis or not, whether they were using mental health services or not. And over 150 people did. Sometimes people only wrote around about 30 or 40 words. Some people wrote over 2,000 words. On average, people wrote us about 500 words about their own experience. To our surprise, schizophrenia wasn't the most common diagnosis that people reported. Schizoaffective disorder, something slightly different, was the most common, followed by bipolar disorder. Schizophrenia was only the fourth most common diagnosis. And after that, there were many other examples of different diagnoses, such as PTSD, certain kinds of depression and anxiety. And there were 26 people in the sample who had no diagnosis at all. The voices that they described across all these different groups were actually very similar. Voices could be inside or outside the head. Most people reported having more than one voice. About 2/3 reported voices having a distinct character or personality. In our questionnaire, we tried to avoid very specific questions about, say, how loud a voice is or where it is in space. We just wanted people to describe it on their own terms, to see if they actually described it in terms of things like loudness. And about 45% of people did talk about their voices in literally auditory terms, so they talked about pitch and tone, position in space and loudness. But 1/3 of people reported something which was a bit more of a mixture. They talked quite specifically about hearing voices, but they said that the voices they experienced were more like a mixture of hearing something and a thought. Still felt very separate from them, but didn't really feel like it was something coming through their ears. I'll give you an example. One participant said, "I did not hear the voices orally. They were much more intimate than that and inescapable. It's hard to describe how I could hear a voice that wasn't auditory, but the words the voices used and the emotions they contained, hatred and disgust, were completely clear, distinct and unmistakable. maybe even more so than if I'd heard them orally. Alongside this, a large proportion of people talked about their body feeling different when they heard voices. So they talk about things like a tingling that would go through their body when they heard a voice, or a burning in their skin. One person described the impact of hearing a voice as being like a punch to the stomach. And some people talked about their voices appearing to have a physical presence of their own, not a vision, but just a feeling that somebody was there. For example, one person said, "I've never encountered anyone with as powerful a presence as my voices. They are loud and feel enormous. Maybe I just don't spend enough time around aggressive people. They feel very much here when I hear them." And these kinds of experiences are interesting because actually they suggest a whole range of possible overlaps with some very different contexts and examples. Feelings of pure presence, feeling of somebody being there without hearing them or seeing them, are common in neurological disorders such as Parkinson's disease. The common following grief and bereavement, in fact they're the most common kind of hallucinatory experience that somebody will have following grief, much more so than seeing or hearing something. The feeling of somebody being there, so still being in a favourite chair or still being upstairs. They're common in survival situations. They're known as the third man factor in survival situations. So people right at the limit of endurance, maybe on a polar trek or stuck up in the Himalayas, sometimes they'll report a feeling of somebody being with them right at the moment of crisis for the period in which they're most vulnerable, and that being won't talk, that being won't necessarily do anything. Sometimes it will move and follow down the path they need to go, and sometimes they're described in kind of guardian angel terms. And finally, a more malevolent kind of presence that occurs is in the context of sleep paralysis. Now, a third of the population will have some experience of sleep paralysis. This is the experience of waking up and not being able to move your body. It's a consequence of the muscle paralysis that occurs when we sleep naturally, that sometimes doesn't switch off quickly enough when you wake up. And when people have this sleep paralysis experience, it's very common for them to report the feeling of somebody in the room. Sometimes this presence will be moving towards them, sometimes this presence will push down on their chest and will feel like it has a malevolent intent. And actually some of the voices that the voice hearers were describing in our survey were getting much closer to that feeling of a presence alongside them. And that's perhaps the key that I'd like to leave you with before we move on to discussion this evening. But voices can be many and various. They can occur in people who need help and people who don't. They can prompt a range of feelings, positive and negative. But at root, they have the impact of being spoken to by a real person or being. And that's maybe why they make such a difference to people's lives. It's not just about hearing something strange or hearing a voice on a tape recorder or on the radio. It's much more like having another person with you, carrying somebody with you, somebody visiting you, whether you want them there or not. And I'm going to leave you with that and just say thank you for listening this evening, and I hope I can help answer your questions in the following discussion.
Cafe Culture North East is supported by Newcastle University, Peels and Dance City. We're also supported by DC Cafe, who host the events.